Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Legend of the Third Degree from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Legend of the Third Degree. The most important and significant of the legendary symbols of Freemasonry is undoubtedly that which relates to the fate of Hiram Abif, commonly called, by way of excellence, the Legend of the Third Degree. The first written record that I have been able to find of this legend is contained in the second edition of Anderson's Constitutions, published in 1738, page 14, and is in these words: "It, the temple, was finished in the short space of 7 years and 6 months, to the amazement of all the world, when the capstone was celebrated by the fraternity with great joy. But their joy was soon interrupted by the sudden death of their dear master, Hiram Abif, whom they decently interred in the lodge near the temple, according to ancient usage." In the next edition of the same work, published in 1756, page 24, a few additional circumstances are related, such as the participation of King Solomon in the general grief, and the fact that the King of Israel ordered his obsequies to be performed with great solemnity and decency. With these exceptions, and the citations of the same passages made by subsequent authors, the narrative has always remained unwritten and descended from age to age through the means of oral tradition. The legend has been considered of so much importance that it has been preserved in the symbolism of every Masonic rite. No matter what modifications or alterations the general system may have undergone, no matter how much the ingenuity or the imagination of the founders of rites may have perverted or corrupted other symbols, abolishing the old and substituting new ones, the legend of the temple builder has ever been left untouched to present itself in all the integrity of its ancient mythical form. What then is the signification of this symbol, so important and so extensively diffused? What interpretation can we give to it that will account for its universal adoption? How is it that it has thus become so intimately interwoven with Freemasonry as to make, to all appearances, a part of its very essence, and to have been always deemed inseparable from it? To answer these questions satisfactorily, it is necessary to trace, in a brief investigation, the remote origin of the institution of Freemasonry and its connection with the ancient systems of initiation. It was, then, the object of all the rites and mysteries of antiquity to teach the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. This dogma, shining as an almost solitary beacon light in the surrounding gloom of pagan darkness, had undoubtedly been received from that ancient people or priesthood, among whom it probably existed only in the form of an abstract proposition or a simple and unembellished tradition. But in the more sensual minds of the pagan philosophers and mystics, the idea, when presented to the initiates in their mysteries, was always conveyed in the form of a scenic representation. The influence, too, of the early Sabian worship of the sun and heavenly bodies, in which the solar orb was adored on its resurrection each morning from the apparent death of its evening setting, caused this rising sun to be adopted in the more ancient mysteries as a symbol of the regeneration of the soul. Thus, in the Egyptian mysteries, we find a representation of the death and subsequent regeneration of Osiris, in the Phoenician of Adonis, in the Syrian of Dionysus, in all of which the scenic apparatus of initiation was intended to indoctrinate the candidate into the dogma of a future life. It will be sufficient here to refer to the theory of Oliver that through the instrumentality of the Tyrian workmen at the Temple of King Solomon, what he calls the spurious and pure branches of the Masonic system were united at Jerusalem, and that the same method of scenic representation was adopted by the latter from the former, and the narrative of the temple builder substituted for that of Dionysus, which was the myth peculiar to the mysteries practiced by the Tyrian workmen. The idea, therefore, proposed to be communicated in the myth of the ancient mysteries was the same as that which is now conveyed in the Masonic legend of the Third Degree. Hence, then, Hiram Abif is, in the Masonic system, the symbol of human nature, as developed in the life here and the life to come. And so, while the temple was the visible symbol of the world, its builder became the mythical symbol of man, the dweller and worker in that world. Man, setting forth on the voyage of life with faculties and powers fitting him for the due exercise of the high duties to whose performance he has been called, holds, if he be a curious and cunning workman, skilled in all moral and intellectual purposes, and it is only of such men that the temple builder can be the symbol, within the grasp of his attainment, the knowledge of all that divine truth, that race to whom it has been granted to look with exalted countenance on high, which divine truth is symbolized by the Word. Thus, provided with the Word of life, he occupies his time in the construction of a spiritual temple, and travels onward in the faithful discharge of all his duties, laying down his designs upon the trestle board of the future, and invoking the assistance and direction of God. But is his path always over flowery meads and through pleasant groves? Is there no hidden foe to obstruct his progress? Is all before him clear and calm, with joyous sunshine and refreshing zephyrs? Alas, not so. Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upwards. At every gate of life, as the Orientalists have beautifully called the different ages, he is beset by peril. Temptations allure his youth. Misfortunes darken the pathway of his manhood, and his old age is encumbered with infirmity and disease. But clothed in the armor of virtue, he may resist the temptation. He may cast misfortunes aside and rise triumphantly above them. But to the last, the direst, the most inexorable foe of his race, he must eventually yield, and stricken down by death, he sinks prostrate into the grave and is buried in the rubbish of his sin and human frailty. Here then, in Masonry, is what was called the aphonism, concealment or disappearance in the ancient mysteries. The bitter but necessary lesson of death has been imparted. The living soul with the lifeless body which encased it has disappeared and can nowhere be found. All is darkness, confusion, despair. Divine truth, the word for a time, is lost, and the Master Mason may now say, in the language of Hutchinson, "I prepare my sepulchre, I make my grave in the pollution of the earth, I am under the shadow of death." But if the mythic symbolism ended here with this lesson of death, then were the lesson incomplete. That teaching would be vain and idle, nay more, it would be corrupt and pernicious, which should stop short of the conscious and innate instinct for another existence. And hence, the succeeding portions of the legend are intended to convey the sublime symbolism of a resurrection from the grave and a new birth into a future life. The discovery of the body, which in the initiations of the ancient mysteries was called the euresis, and its removal from the polluted grave into which it had been cast, to an honored and sacred place within the precincts of the temple, are all profoundly and beautifully symbolic of that great truth, the discovery of which was the object of all the ancient initiations, as it is almost the whole design of Freemasonry, namely, that when man shall have passed the gates of life and have yielded to the inexorable fiat of death, he shall then, not in the pictured ritual of an earthly lodge, but in the realities of that eternal one, of which the former is but an antitype, be raised at the omnific word of the Grand Master of the universe, from time to eternity, from the tomb of corruption to the chambers of hope, from the darkness of death to the celestial beams of life, and that his disembodied spirit shall be conveyed as near to the Holy of Holies of the divine presence as humanity can ever approach to deity. Such I conceive to be the true interpretation of the symbolism of the legend of the third degree. I have said that this mythical history of the temple builder was universal in all nations and all rites, and that in no place and at no time had it, by alteration, diminution, or addition, acquired any essentially new or different form. The myth has always remained the same. But it is not so with its interpretation. That which I have just given, and which I conceive to be the correct one, has been very generally adopted by the Masons of America. But elsewhere and by various writers, other interpretations have been made, very different in their character, although always agreeing in retaining the general idea of a resurrection or regeneration, or a restoration of something from an inferior to a higher sphere or function. Thus, some of the earlier continental writers have supposed the myth to have been a symbol of the destruction of the Order of the Templars, looking upon its restoration to its original wealth and dignities as being prophetically symbolized. In some of the high philosophical degrees, it is taught that the whole legend refers to the sufferings and death with the subsequent resurrection of Christ. Hutchinson, who has the honor of being the earliest philosophical writer on Freemasonry in England, supposes it to have been intended to embody the idea of the decadence of the Jewish religion and the substitution of the Christian in its place and on its ruins. Dr. Oliver thinks that it is typical of the murder of Abel and Cain, and that it symbolically refers to the universal death of our race through Adam, and its restoration to life in the Redeemer. According to the expression of the Apostle, as in Adam we all died, so in Christ we all live. Reagan makes Hiram a symbol of the sun, shorn of its vivifying rays and fructifying power by the 3 winter months, and its restoration to prolific heat by the season of spring. And finally, Des Tangs, adopting in part the interpretation of Reagan, adds to it another which he calls the moral symbolism of the legend, and supposes that Hiram is no other than eternal reason, whose enemies are the vices that deprave and destroy humanity. To each of these interpretations, it seems to me that there are important objections, though perhaps to some less so than to others. As to those who seek for an astronomical interpretation of the legend in which the annual changes of the sun are symbolized, while the ingenuity with which they press their argument cannot but be admired, it is evident that, by such an interpretation, they yield all that Masonry has gained of religious development in past ages, and fall back upon that corruption and perversion of Sabaeism, from which it was the object even of the spurious Freemasonry of antiquity to rescue its disciples. The Templar interpretation of the myth must at once be discarded if we would avoid the difficulties of anachronism, unless we deny that the legend existed before the abolition of the Order of Knights Templar, and such denial would be fatal to the antiquity of Freemasonry. And as to the adoption of the Christian reference, Hutchinson, and after him Oliver, profoundly philosophical as are the Masonic speculations of both, have, I am constrained to believe, fallen into a great error in calling the Master Mason's degree a Christian institution. It is true that it embraces within its scheme the great truths of Christianity upon the subject of the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. But this was to be presumed because Freemasonry is truth and Christianity is truth, and all truth must be identical. But the origin of each is different, their histories are dissimilar. The creed of Freemasonry is the primitive one of Noah and his immediate descendants. If Masonry were simply a Christian institution, the Jew and the Muslim, the Brahman and the Buddhist could not conscientiously partake of its illumination, but its universality is its boast. In its language, citizens of every nation may converse. At its altar, men of all religions may kneel. To its creed, disciples of every faith may subscribe. But the true ancient interpretation of the legend, the universal Masonic one for all countries and all ages, undoubtedly was that the fate of the temple builder is but figurative of the pilgrimage of man on earth through trials and temptations, through sin and sorrow, until his eventual fall beneath the blow of death, and his final and glorious resurrection to another and an eternal life. And now, in conclusion, a word of historical criticism may not be misplaced. It is not at all essential to the value of the symbolism that the legend shall be proved to be historical, whether considered as a truthful narrative of an event that actually transpired during the building of the temple, or simply as a myth embodying the utterance of a religious sentiment. The symbolic lesson of life and death and immortality is still contained in its teachings and commands our earnest attention. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much,